John Law, the son of wealthy Scottish goldsmiths turned bankers. Until his 17th year, he followed the family trade, but when his father died, he decided that banking was too honest of an employment for him and moved to the seedier side of London. There, he rapidly found that women and cards were far more to his liking than ledgers and receipts. He lived it up as the rake and rogue of lower London. But between the fast women, the high fashion, and the low cards, he more than once ended up having to run home and ask Mom for a loan just to get by. But it all came to a head one foggy evening in Bloomsbury Square. Law had a rival for one of his lady loves. A drunken quarrel turned into a duel. Blades were drawn. A step, a thrust. One man fell, red between the pavers. Before he could flee, Law was apprehended. He was hauled before the famous hanging judge, Salathiel Lovell, and sentenced to death. As he awaited the gallows, though, his friends and benefactors got his sentence commuted to manslaughter, and he was slapped with a fine and released. But the family of his rival was pulling strings too, and they appealed the decision. This time, Law knew to flee. He hightailed it to the Dutch Republic, enjoying the coffee houses, the gambling, and perhaps most of all, the stock market of Amsterdam. While he had always been of an intellectual bent, it's here he started to really refine his ideas, both about gambling and finance. Watching this small republic with none of the natural resources of the other great countries of Europe dominate the world's economic landscape galvanized his thoughts. He reasoned that if he could just understand what had created such an economic revolution there, he could export it to nations with more natural advantages. So, he spent half a decade considering the problem, and all this reasoning led him to one conclusion. It was the supply of money and the availability of credit that made the Dutch Republic such a powerhouse. And where did he see the bottleneck in the availability of money and thus the availability of credit? The supply of gold and silver. If you're only going to lend out gold and silver, you have to have the gold and silver to lend, and that puts a ceiling on the size of your economy, which, while not absolute, is a lot more rigid than paper. And so he began to formulate his treatise, Money and Trade Considered, with a proposal for supplying the nation with money, with the aim of getting his native Scotland to create a national bank. Unfortunately, Scotland was destitute from risky Central American ventures and a failed harvest. The Scots were in no mood to take a risk on some theory. To cap the whole thing off, the Act of Union in 1707 not only crushed any chance Law had of convincing the Scottish Parliament of his plan, but also made him an outlaw in Scotland as well as England. So once more, our ironically named hero fled back to the continent. For the next 10 years, he moved between France and the Dutch Republic, speculating, gambling, and socializing. But Law was always one to learn from his mistakes. He no longer gambled simply as a gamble. Now it was a system. He put into practice the many ideas that translated from the financial world. He deconstructed the games he played, and worked out great tables of outcomes. He was renowned for being able to calculate precise odds on the fly and hold them all in his head. And soon it paid off. This time, instead of gambling his way to the poorhouse, he became one of the richest men in Europe, amassing what today would probably be hundreds of millions of dollars just from cards and market speculation. But his gambling did one other thing for him. It opened doors. He was affable, charming, and very well dressed. As he gambled across Europe, he worked his way up to playing at private, very high-stakes games in Paris, games which included some of the most powerful men of the land. And in these smoky rooms, he had far more opportunity to persuade them of his ideas than he'd had in Scotland. And the truth is, those men were primed to be persuaded. The wars of Louis XIV had left the French treasury empty, and the state burdened with insurmountable debt. The new regent and his council were looking for a way out, so when Law said that he had a plan, they listened. The plan was ambitious. He would form a central bank which would take over many of the economic functions of the state, right down to issuing money, which of course would take the form of his beloved banknotes. Most importantly though, his plan to bankroll it was genius. He allowed people to buy stock at the bank, paying only 1/6 of the stock's value in cash, and paying the rest by trading in their government bonds, the debts the government owed them. This scheme was genius, because the population of France knew that these government bonds were currently worthless, because the government was too broke to repay them. Yet, at the same time, much of the debt which the government had been crippled trying to service was the very debt the people of France held. So, in having everybody traded in, this debt magically disappeared, and people who previously thought that they had been ruined by purchasing worthless government bonds now had something of worth that they could sell or trade, stock in the new bank, because everybody was confident in the new bank. Genius. And as John's bank began to tick away, it all seemed to work. The paper currency was far more stable than the old silver currency. Nobody could clip its edges, and forgeries were, well, punishable by death.